So I'm going to talk about what is constituent and the constituent power, and I have organized my talk into three main parts. I want just to introduce some preliminary thoughts in order to let you understand what is the focus of my talk. Modern thought has considered constituent power as subordinated to constituted power. A constitutive, productive subordination, since constituent power is thought as the source of constituted power. Such a conception involves some implications. It refers to an idea of constituent power as an exception that breaks the crust of the normal functioning of power. The function of the exception would be that of allowing a new institution of power. The function of the exception would be, so this one. This is what I think is the dominant conception of the constituent power in the modern thought. My paper aims at reversing such a conception by setting out from some traditions of thought, primarily the Operaist tradition, workerism in English. It tries to show that constituted power is the exception, the anomaly which constantly tries to block or to fix what per definition cannot be fixed, since it is the source of each democratic process. Constituted power is the exception that tries to block the force of constituent power. But to make this thesis clear, one must consider what is constituent in the constituent power. Before getting into the issues involved in this discussion, let me also remark what is at stake in this topic orbiting the question of the constituent power. The question of constituent power refers back to the question of democracy. To speak of constituent power is to speak of democracy. But it is also to speak of revolution. In the first part of my talk, I will focus on different conceptions of the constituent power, which examine the possible dialectic between constituent and constituted power. These conceptions range from the early modern to the contemporary time. They range from Machiavelli and Gabriel Naudet to Carl Schmitt, Walter Benjamin, and George Agamben. The name of Gabriel Naudet probably is not so very well known, is intimately related to one of the major issues at the core of his work, is related to the idea of the coup d'etat and its function for the shape of modern power. A topic that is intertwined not only with the debate on the notion of a state of exception, but also with the question of revolution. In the second part of my talk, I'll take into account the difference between the notion of political revolution and that of social revolution. I will do that by referring to a lesser-known work, but one whose weight, I believe, could be decisive in contemporary debates. It is the work of the Italian philosopher Nicola Massimo De Feo that you can read at the bottom of this page. Among all the problems I have already indicated in this brief introductory note, there is one that gives my speech its title, which should also guide the entire reflection: what is constituent in constituent power? That is to say, from where does constituent power draw its force? Let me start from some considerations on the coup d'etat. The first thing that has to be remarked, otherwise we don't understand anything, concerning this issue is the profound difference between our modern conception of the coup d'etat, which started after the French Revolution, and that emerging from during the 17th century, to which the considerations of Gabriel Naudet are related. In the 17th century, the coup d'etat was considered as a necessary reaction against a disorder that threatened the stability of the state and the order of the world. The coup d'etat was a stroke of majesty, a coup de majesté in French, an instrument to reestablish legitimate power. the coup d'etat was considered as an action that decides something important for the sake of the state and the prince. A decisive, extreme, violent act by which the prince not only decides and brings to a definitive conclusion what is at stake in a particular situation and context, but also, hence the sense of the coup d'etat as extraordinary or exceptional, places his act at the limits of his power. The prince coup d'etat is state power returning to the original violence of its foundation. In the very instant of its manifestation, the coup d'etat reveals the foundation of power. Gabriel Naudet writes, it is the apocalypse of its origin. In the 17th century, the coup d'etat is considered as an act of violence that exceeds the law, but is not in opposition to the raison d'etat. There are times when the raison d'etat can no longer make use of the laws, when it is obliged by some pressing and urgent event to free itself from these laws in the name of the salvation of the state. This is the moment when the coup d'etat bursts forth as a manifestation of the raison d'etat. If the coup d'etat is a coup de force, a coup de main, that suspends the law, what role does it play in the art of governing? Is it an expression of the original dimension of politics? Is it a force of law outside the law, to say that with Jacques Derrida? During the Ancien Régime, a coup d'etat was never interpreted as an insurrection, a disorder that makes its eruption in the normal functioning of the state. On the contrary, the coup d'etat in the 17th century was a reaction, as I said, against disorder. Necessities call for a coup d'etat. The concept of necessity underlies both the state of exception and the coup d'etat. Necessity underpins the requirement for derogation. When we pose the question of necessity, we are from the outset dealing with the theory of exception. Necessity will ensure that the singular case is exempt from the rule and from compliance with the rule. In medieval doctrine, necessity was not the source of the law, nor was it the suspension of the law. The function of necessity was to remove the singular case from the application of the norm. It was with the moderns that the state of necessity was integrated into the legal order, thus becoming the source and foundation of the law. The state of exception is a figure of necessity insofar as it makes possible the production of a new constitutional regime. In the modern era, for example, the right to revolution is recognized. This right to revolution is a case of the state of exception insofar as it presupposes the suspension of the normal functioning of law in order to establish a new order. But how can we interpret necessity? What is its nature? Is it an objective situation? Is it a fact, a factuality? Or does it imply subjective judgment and evaluation? Is it an objective fact, or is any situation declared as such to be considered necessary and exceptionally? Clearly, if we accept the idea that necessity implies subjective evaluation, we are immediately confronted with a major problem, the problem of decision. Sovereign, writes Carl Schmitt, is the one who decides on the state of exception. That is to say, the one who decides on necessity. It is the decision that enables the recognition of necessity. The state of exception thus coincides with constituent power, as Schmitt shows. Schmitt discusses the state of exception in the form of dictatorship. The problem he poses is that of inscribing the state of exception in the legal context. How can the state of exception be articulated in the legal order if what is to be inscribed in the law is essentially external to the law? This is one of the problems posed by Schmitt's analysis. In other words, how can an outside be written in the law. Schmitt refers to the distinction between constituent power and constituted power. Constituent power is not simply a matter of force, but is linked to constituted power in such a way that it appears as a founding power. If constituent power is what enables the state of exception to be inscribed in the legal order, Schmitt's political theology, on the other hand, envisages another operator, namely the relationship between norm and decision. It is the decision that enables such an inscription. But this attempt does not go without generating problems, for, as Giorgio Agamben points out, the state of exception is an empty space of law. The state of exception is an ambiguous zone where all legal determination is deactivated. This means that neither Schmittian theory, which aims to establish a relationship between legal order and the state of exception, nor the theory of necessity, which makes the state of exception the original legal source, can fully account for the nature of the state of exception. The state of exception, like the state of necessity, is neither a state of law nor a state of nature. It is a space, Agamben says, without law. It is a non-place, a space where the force of law is suspended. But suspended does not mean that the law simply withdraws. Rather, it means that it becomes effective in its very withdrawal or suspension. It is the force of law which separates itself from the law, which is in force. It is as if the state of exception is a legal vacuum that carries force. These considerations allow us to move our analysis on to a second stage where we can take into account another perspective that's sketched out by Walter Benjamin in his essay, The Critique of Violence. Benjamin attempts to give violence a place outside and beyond the law. What does this mean? It means that he's trying to break the link or dialectic between a violence that posits law and a violence that preserves and guards it. Benjamin refers, on the one hand, to pure or divine violence, and on the other one, in the human sphere, to revolutionary violence. What the law cannot in any way tolerate, what it perceives as a threat that cannot be overcome, is the existence of violence outside the law, violence that cannot be absorbed into the law. But not because it's incompatible, but because it is violence outside the law. And in this case, it's a violence that doesn't raise the question of the law. It is a violence that doesn't preserve law, but deposes it. If Schmitt was trying to reduce violence to a legal context, Benjamin is trying to ensure violence pure existence. For Schmitt, there can be no such thing as pure violence, violence outside the law. The state of exception is Schmitt's means of including violence in the law without exclusion. Schmitt's response to the question of pure violence is to develop a theory of sovereignty that revolves around sovereign violence. That is to say, sovereignty as the locus of extreme decision-making, the locus of extreme violence. And this sovereignty is placed by Schmitt at the limit as a borderline concept, Grenzbegriff. If for Schmitt the sovereign is the one who decides on the state of exception, Benjamin, on the other hand, introduces the question of sovereign indecision. That is to say, the fact that the sovereign cannot decide, which is totally different from the fact that the sovereign is able, that is to say, is in the position of not deciding. It is in his power the possibility of non-decision. No, Benjamin is talking about the fact that sovereign cannot decide, between power and the exercise of power, Benjamin inscribes a gap that no decision can fill. So, as Agamben points out, instead of finding ourselves faced with the miracle of the sovereign decision as the moment that will resolve the crisis, that will compose a new juridical order, we find ourselves faced with catastrophe. Benjamin's insistence on pure violence, which is the name he chooses to indicate human action that neither posits nor preserves law, but rather deposits it, is not an original figure of human action. It would be illusory to imagine a pure violence that lies beyond and outside the law, and which should at some point be captured by the law. The pure violence of which Benjamin speaks is not an original state. It is what is at stake in the conflict over the state of exception. What the state of exception produces, what happens in the game played by the state of exception. On the other hand, when Benjamin uses the word reine Gewalt, pure violence, what does it mean? What does he mean by pure? Pure does not refer to a purity that exists somewhere and must be preserved. It is not a purity in itself, an unconditioned and absolute purity, a purity that refers to itself, namely to its being. On the contrary, the concept is entirely inscribed in a relational and not substantial dimension. Pure violence, to differentiate it from juridical violence, is such in its relation to something external. It is in this relation that pure violence is constituted. Let us now consider a second moment in which I focus on the difficult relationship between political revolution and social revolution. In two fundamental books published in the early 90s, as the result of a research begun in the early 70s, De Feo traced the history and debate of the German sociology during the Reich years by focusing on the experiences of the Verein für Sozialpolitik. In this research, De Feo analyzes in particular the works of Max Weber, Werner Sombart, Gustav von Schmoller, and Lujo Brentano, among others, and contrasts the history of capitalist reformism and rationalization reconstructed through the discussions of the Verein für Sozialpolitik with the subversive forces of the social proletariat, whose history consists essentially of a chain of insurrectionary historical events. In his book, The Autonomy of the Negative, it doesn't exist in English and in any other language, unfortunately, he reconstructs the history of proletarian uprising by studying the collective and individual struggles of anarchists such as, I beg your pardon, my friends from Russia, for my pronunciation, Sergei Nechayev, August Reinsdorf, Johann Most, Josef Peukert, Arnold Roller, and Karl Plättner. In this way, De Feo showed the gap between the struggles of the large sectors of the social proletariat and the socialist and reformist strategies of the most important organization of the workers' movement. From a theoretical point of view, De Feo thus follows two pathways. Firstly, by reconstructing the debates within the Verein für Sozialpolitik, he shows how, within the framework of this association, Marx's work and Marxism, in the broader sense, were reduced to an ideology of labor. This interpretation of Marx, developed by the most famous German sociologists, from Werner Sombart to Max Weber, made it possible to legalize the work of Marx by erasing its revolutionary political trait. If one erases the revolutionary trait of Marx's work, his constant reference to the workers' revolution, his work becomes a tool to analyze and justify the development of capitalism. De Feo's interpretation is of particular importance because it shows the debates that marked the Verein für Sozialpolitik paved the way for social democratic reformism. The importance of the other workers' movement It's the title of a not well-known book by Karl-Heinz Roth, written at the end of the 70s, lies in the fact that this work continually highlights the irreducibly revolutionary character of Marx's work by insisting on the power of workers' revolution. Why is this work of De Feo so important for our discussion today? Because it focuses on the question and on the notion of negativity, on the negative. So the dualism between social and political revolution is the problem indicated in the title of The Autonomy of the Negative. On the one hand, the social revolution is a politics of the class, of a multitude, of people. De Feo explains in a very Marxian way that the social revolution is the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. This movement is not ideological or based on an idea or an ideal. It is the movement of existence. It is the antagonistic movement of existence which rejects the present state of things. On the other hand, political revolutions are much more oriented toward the politics of the state, understood as constitutional order. An emancipatory force, a political ideal, spreads out from a political revolution. In the political revolution, the force of the constituent power leads to constituted power. If the social revolution evokes a politics of insurrection, the political revolution refers to a politics of constitution. Both forms of revolution are not exempted from a major problem that crosses the whole modernity and that may be sketched out in this way. There is no equality when the freedoms of each individual are guaranteed, and there is no individual freedom when equality is affirmed. This is the basis of the conflict between the characteristics, ideologies of modernity, from social democracy to liberalism, to nationalism, and to communism. The problem returns in the social revolution. De Feo shows this in The Autonomy of the Negative when he refers to the political experience of Sergei Nechayev. The nihilistic fascination emanating from this character should not lead us to forget Bakunin's critique of Nechayev's terrorist theories. The total war that Nechayev declared against the state and capitalism should culminate in the creation of a totalitarian state similar in some ways to the fascist state and in others to the Stalinist state. But why does De Feo insist on the notion of autonomy of the negative? The formulation of an autonomy of the negative indicates how indocile the negative is. The negative remains autonomous when it prevents the absorption of the social revolution into a totalizing totality in which a political revolution centered on the state prevails. De Feo gives an extremely Nietzschean definition of the negative as eternal return and not as contradiction. What returns is not only a negation, but also an affirmation. The first movement is a movement that dissolves, but the second reappropriates. The two movements occur simultaneously. On the one hand, there is the breaking of the iron cage. The social revolution is the movement of despair, a movement rooted in the tragical despair. In that sense, beautiful pages on Dostoevsky could help us to understand this issue, in the poverty of existence. But at the same time, the radical poverty is the way to open on the infinite possibilities of life. On the one hand, there is subversion that denies the power, that represses and annihilates. There is the refusal of the present state of things. On the other hand, there is the affirmation of a praxis of liberation. De Feo also speaks of a spiral connection that links existing and possible contradictions to the liberation of new and possible territories of knowledge and action. The spiral progression of the movement implies the fact that the negative always repeats itself in a different way in the form of an eternal return. In this perspective, the negative is understood in Marxian terms and is declined in the conflict between labor power and capital, as sketched out by Marx in the Grundrisse. De Feo speaks of the negative as non-capital and non-labor that ceases to operate as a dependent variable and explode in the subversion of the social proletariat. Such subversion would imply the critical reappropriation of the negative. The definition of autonomy of the negative given by De Feo is irreducible to the thought of the negative theorized in the years in which he wrote the text published late in 1992 by Massimo Cacciari in Crisis. In this case, the negative was understood as a function of an immanent transformation that confirms the insuperability of the capitalist system. The reference to Cacciari's conception of the negative highlights the originality of De Feo's position with respect to the more paradoxical and yet recurrent readings of politics today. For example, the reading of George Agamben. In his case, we are not confronted, as in the case of Cacciari, with a negativity that is subsumed to the idea of development. The negative in Agamben's account becomes a function of an ontology of the unrealizable that affirms both the revolution and the impossibility of making it. It is no more the potence of the negativity, but the impotence, the impossibility of the passage to the act. The power of the negative would be so powerful that it should remain in itself, because if it were implemented, it would be emptied. To some extent, it would be interesting to compare De Feo's conception of the negative with Adorno's conception as developed in negative dialectics. The negative, Adorno argues, is a movement of differentiation, that is of the becoming that does not coincide with what is already given. The non-identical is the negative. In political terms, the negative escapes capitalist subsumption, although the capitalism never stops trying to capture the negative. Or at the same time, the non-identical, that is to say, the not yet captured by the domination of capital, asserts a difference from the existing domination and shows that the system unitary is mythical, its identity is coercive. What we have to highlight in this conception of Adorno that presents similarities with that of De Feo is the fact that, contrary to the widespread totalitarian theories of capitalism, from extractivism to the idea of an absolute capitalism, this process is not closed in on itself. This is the theoretical and political relevance of De Feo's autonomy of the negative. With Adorno and De Feo, after Adorno and De Feo, let's consider Antonio Negri's account. In the wake of the Operaist tradition, in which Negri's work is entirely inscribed, at the core of Negri's work, there is the question of the living labor. For Negri, living labor is essentially subjectivity, power that cannot never be completely subsumed by capital. Living labor is subjectivity that struggles against capital. It is on this point that Negri recognized the greatness of the workerist tradition, and in particular of Mario Tronti's work, Workers and Capital. But the second point Negri stresses is the fact that subjectivity is subversive. It cannot be subsumed under the power of capital. Negri will draw this thesis through an in-depth analysis in which he intertwines two perspectives, the one coming from a close reading of Marx's Grundrisse, the other one rooted in the philosophy of Spinoza. By focusing on subjectivity, the Grundrisse paved the way to a theory of communism emerging within the capitalist relations of production. Among the points that most mark the distance of Negri's theory from other Marxist traditions is the thesis that communism is not a product of capitalist development. It is its radical, I quote, inversion. Communism is neither a teleology of the capitalist system nor its catastrophe. It is a new subject which takes form, which transforms reality and destroys capital. I stop here, so I let aside this part on Antonio Negri. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva Tanasso, Bard College, Berlin. So I just wanted to ask you if you could recapitulate how does this lineage of thinking relate to the concept of constituent power, right? Because, yeah, maybe if you can just summarize that.
It's very easy and very complicated at the same time. Let me say that, well, the main thesis consists in that. We approach the question of constituent power. So all theories in the modern time, the dominant theories in the modern time, ranging from Hobbes on, and then through Meinecke, whatever we want, no? They stress the fact that constituent power is in a dialectical movement with the constituted power. It is precisely what relates also to the second part of the talk, where the question is the question of revolution. That is to say, for us, revolution is a moment where a constitutional order is broken, and so is broken because there are some forces that we can call constituent power, and constituent power is in that sense subordinate to the idea of a constituted power. Revolution has its right to exist, but in what sense in this dominant conception? In the sense that the revolution is an exception where the normal function of society is interrupted in order to create a new constitutional order. The perspective that you have philosophically in the Feo, and then also in the idea of insurgencies, that is the English title of the book by Antonio Negri on constituent power. You know? The idea by Antonio Negri is a reversing of this idea. That is to say that, well, constituent power is rooted in the form of a subjectivity that is always in a form of becoming, of transformation. And in that sense, the conception of democracy is the conception of something that is like a work site, that is to say, something that is always in progress. Then there are moments, but these moments, of course, they can also last for a very, very long time, of course, where constitutional order tries to block the power of this democracy that is at the bottom of everything. In that sense, the constitutional order is the exception. Is the exception because it is going to block the power in English, you know, in this constellation of thinkers doesn't work very much because we have to distinguish between two different concepts, you know. Power is, in English in that sense, is what we in French or in Italian we call pouvoir, potere, but it is opposed to the idea of force, to the idea of strength, to the idea of potentia. So this potentia is what is inscribed within the constituent power. So if you want, the general thesis I tried to present here was just to interrupt this dialectical moment between constituent power and constituted power, and to show that constituent power is the motor of democracy.
Quick follow-up. Why is constitutional order blocking that power rather than channeling and making it constructive?
Historically, that is to say, it's only a question of a genealogical reconstruction of the history. I'm not saying that is a meta theory. It's an historical reconstruction. That is to say, the way how capitalism has worked for the last 2 centuries, 3 centuries, or power also in the past, has always been this way. That is to say that also the moments where the constituent power has been so strong, but also in the moment where we can say political revolutions have been so strong, that it comes all the time a moment where the constitutional power, that is to say different forms of power, are able to capture these forces and to orient them in other also directions. So it's not a question that, you know, I don't think at all that we should embrace, we should give in a theory of power in negative terms. I'm too Foucauldian to accept that, you know. Power for me is a productive thing, either. That is to say that, well, it can also shape situations that can be for the best, you know. So I don't share an idea of power or of law only in terms of negation of repression. These categories have to be called dramatically in question.
Hello, Jan Smolenski, University of Warsaw. Thank you for this talk. I would like to somehow ask, I think, related question, right? So my first, actually two questions. First question is, why do you think that constituent power is subordinated in this typical interpretation, given that it can destroy the constitutional order, right? Through the whatever, explosion of whatever generative capacity of the people, or however you want to phrase it, right? And my other question is a question about democracy, because you seem to say that democracy is an incessant self-constitution, right? But here my question is, isn't a logical implication of constituent power a creation of a constitution, right, as somehow stabilized order? Because if not, aren't we running into the problem that Hannah Arendt already pointed out, meaning the problem of quicksands, right? That we are quicksands, right? We are basically having a completely unstable situation in which sovereign decision in the repressive sense can reign, right?
I'm not quite sure I grasp the first part of your question in the sense, you can correct me. What I said, is that the dominant interpretations in modern political theory, they tend to present constituent power as something that has to be subordinated to constitutive power. Huh? And this is what I'm going. This Operaist tradition, if you want, this neo-Marxist tradition, radical calls into question this kind of subordination. But did I understand clear? So this is the first thing. So this subordination has to be called into question. The second aspect is not just to say that this kind of disjunction has to be operated in order to have a constituent power that works alone. No, constituent powers needs moment where something institutionalized takes place. These forms of institutionalization is also very important. But we have to admit that these forms can never stop, So that is to say that there is no legitimation to some extent or in the end for any form of power. When I say that power can never be legitimated, I don't mean that I tend towards a form of anarchism. I tend towards a form where we are always in an open situation where each situation can be called into question. And so the right of insurrection, of transformation, is always there.
Andreas?
Yes, I think this is a follow-up question. So we assume that constituent power, as you said, is a power to constitute. So you constitute things. But then you say that the things that are constituted block the constituent power. So in other words, in this approach by Negri, it's like if there is a kind of tragedy in the constituent power, because whenever it creates something, the creation will turn against it. It's like the young Marx about objectification. So my question to Negri, and also to you, to Negri has been for many years, is what are the things that the constituent power creates in this very vitalistic understanding that is in a constant permanent movement? What does it do in that constant permanent movement? If whenever it creates something, it has also to destroy it and to start creating again, because so I would like to know what exactly does the constituent power.
Thank you for this very complicated question. Let me see two things. The first one is that in the moment where I try to oppose something that, is absolutely not at work in Negri's assumption, social revolution and political revolution that to some extent are words and concepts that don't work anymore very well because they also are part of a discussion of the 20th century. I try to enlarge our conception of what a revolution is. That is to say that we tend, to some extent, always to limit, the idea of a revolution to political moments with capital letters. And so also to understand resistance also as if resistance or class struggle, conflicts are always something that is there in a form of manifestation, in a very phenomenological form that, well, you can see. And that's the reason why you can also admit that, well, there are periods where there is absolutely no conflict. So this insistence on the idea of social revolution is also a way to enlarge the idea of conflict, not only in terms, of class conflict, but in terms of many other conflicts crossing society. This also means that you cannot also reduce the idea of a revolution to something that is ideological. That is to say that, well, in order to have a movement, you need an idea, you need an ideal. It works too, but I think it's very limited conception. So society, well, that's the reason, now I don't want to come back to this discussion, but the reason why I totally oppose the conception of Hobbes, because Hobbes presents in the end a conception of the civil war that is totally fiction, because was actually in the discussion and in the opposition between the parliament and the monarchy in 1648-51 that took part, so this emerged this discourse of Hobbes. But this discourse on social revolution shows that, well, the reality is a reality of conflict, of civil war, in different forms. I disagree with Negri to some extent, but I don't accept this kind of criticism, and I have to defend him in that sense, because I know that the most important issue and form of criticism, to some extent, against his theory that has, but for other reasons, very weak points, is this idea of vitalism, right? But actually, this idea of vitalism, in the end, is an enlarging of the concept of conatus in Spinoza. What Negri says is that the conflict, so not something that is inscribed within a human nature, tends towards forms of democracy. But these forms of democracy are continuously blocked by different other powers, by different other conflicts. So if you want, I'd like, and I admit that the reason why I think that within the line of the Operaist there are different lines, De Feo introduces a tragical note that you don't have in Negri. This tragical note is the fact that, well, we can also be confronted with periods of extreme poverty. I don't want to say of extreme misery, because misery is a situation where everything is blocked, but of extreme poverty. But this extreme poverty, this is precisely what Marx described in the notebook 3 of the Grundrisse, is also the basis for a change, So the situation where this extreme poverty, the fact that you don't have anything else, anything more, this might be the basis for a new transformation. But what is important in this approach is one thing that is at the bottom of any philosophical approach in that sense, is the radical critique of any form of teleology. So here there is no teleology at all. There is no possibility to say that the development will be in terms of a democratic system or in terms of communism. This will tell us only the reality and the conflict coming in the next years.
I have a small note which is kind of obvious, that is there any... I have two microphones, that's why. Sorry. Yeah. Do you think there are like historical lessons from the last...
Historical?
Lessons.
Does it work?
Lessons, yes.
Lessons, yes. Can we revise, or did you like change your attitude to the post-operaism and to Negri like after like 20 years? Because arguably, I mean, there was an argument that the movements should be affirmative, there shouldn't be negativity, but they should rely on the existing economical potentialities in the material labor. And then now, 2024, this seemed not to work. And the criticism by Ernesto Laclau, which was voiced in the 2000s, that there is no negativity in this theory, therefore it will not lead to any serious results. It looks like it was a fair prediction. And now we see that the movements of immaterial labor proved to be the protests of proletarianized intelligentsia, with all the consequences for this intelligentsia. And now we have the real protests. The real opposition comes from the people who want to do something with their own hands. So it's very classical, except that these people who want to do with their own hands, they're on the right, not on the left. This, for some reason, no one really noticed back then.
Well, I don't know how to manage it with the time, you know.
No, it's a rhetorical question. I just thought that it could be...
It's a very important question, but I don't want to abuse of time, of course. Yeah. Shall I say something about that?
We can move on.
Okay.
No. I just scream of the soul is this. Or if there are no other questions, let's adjourn. And
thank you.